The date was November 16th, 1532. High in the freezing thin air of the Andes Mountains, a small group of exhausted men looked down from the heights. Below them, the valley of Cajamarca glowed with the light of tens of thousands of campfires. It looked like a starlit sky had fallen onto the earth. 168 Spanish soldiers, tattered and terrified, peered into the darkness. Facing them was the most powerful war machine in the Western Hemisphere, the Inca Empire. 80,000 battle-hardened warriors stood ready to crush the invaders at a single word from their living god, the Emperor Atahualpa. For months, the Spaniards had marched deeper into the heart of this mountain kingdom, feeling the trap closing around them. Now, there was no retreat. No reinforcements were coming. Within 24 hours, this small band of adventurers would either be dead, or they would be the masters of a world beyond their wildest dreams. What happened next remains one of the most shocking and brutal turning points in human history. To understand how such a tiny force could destroy a continent-spanning empire in a single afternoon, you have to understand the two lethal systems that collided in that mountain square. The Inca war machine was a miracle of organization and total social control. This was not a loose collection of tribes. It was a bureaucratic empire that controlled 10 million people across 4,000 miles of coastline and mountains. Their army was built on a system of absolute discipline and divine authority. Every Inca warrior was a part of a massive, coordinated organism. They moved across the mountains on a sophisticated road network that put the Romans to shame. They used a decimal system of command where units of 10, 100, and 1,000 moved with the precision of a clock. Their weapons were designed for crushing and shattering. Heavy maces with star-shaped stone or bronze heads, slings that could fire rocks with the force of a modern handgun, and long spears designed to hold a line. But their greatest weapon was psychological. The Inca was not just a king. He was the Sapa, Inca, the son of the Sunday. To his soldiers, he was a literal god walking on earth. When the Sapa Inca commanded, the entire world obeyed. If the head was severed, the body would not know how to fight. This was the empire's greatest strength, and as Francisco Pizarro realized, it was also its fatal flaw. The Spaniards represented a different kind of lethality. They were not just soldiers. They were products of the most violent and competitive military environment on Earth. For 700 years, the Spanish had fought a war of reconquest against the Moors. They had emerged as the finest infantry in Europe. The men with Pizarro were veterans of the Italian wars and the conquest of the Caribbean. They brought with them a military system based on individual initiative, steel metallurgy, and a desperate, religious fanaticism. Their steel swords were the apex of thousand-year-old technology. A Spanish rapier or broadsword could slice through Inca-padded armor like it was paper. Their armor made them nearly invincible to Inca clubs. But their true secret weapon was the horse. To the people of the Andes, who had never seen an animal larger than a llama, the sight of an armored man fused to a four-legged beast that could run at 30 miles. Perhaps, R was a nightmare brought to life. It was a biological tank. Combined with the primitive but terrifying sound of gunpowder through arquebuses and small cannons, the Spanish possessed a shock factor that would soon prove more effective than 10,000 spears. The strategic situation on that morning in 1532 was a masterclass in hubris and desperation. Atahualpa had just won a bloody civil war. He was at the height of his power. To him, the 168 Spaniards were not a threat. They were a curiosity. He saw them as ragged animals that he could easily capture and sacrifice to the Sunday god. He invited them into the square of Cajamarca to demonstrate his magnificence. Pizarro knew his numbers were pathetic. He had 62 cavalrymen and 106 infantrymen. He knew that if he fought a conventional battle in the open, his men would be overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers within minutes. He had studied the tactics of Hernán Cortés in Mexico. He knew that the only way to survive was a decapitation strike. He had to capture the God King. He spent the night of November 15th, praying with his men while they hid in the dark buildings surrounding the square. They were so terrified that many of them could not sleep, their armor clanking as they trembled. But as the sun rose, their fear turned into a cold, lethal resolve. The stage was set for the most consequential ambush of the 16th century. Atahualpa approached the square in a procession that defied belief. Thousands of attendants paved the road with silver and gold dust. The emperor sat on a litter of solid gold, carried on the shoulders of 80 high-ranking lords. Behind him followed thousands of his elite guard. Crucially, they were unarmed. Atahualpa was so confident in his divine status that he believed the Spaniards would surrender the moment they saw his glory. He entered the square of Cajamarca and found it empty. he shouted. "Where are they?" A single man emerged from the shadows. Friar Vicente de Valverde. He carried a Bible and a cross. He began to preach about the Christian God and the Spanish king. He handed the Bible to the emperor. Atahualpa, who had no concept of a book, held the object to his ear. When it did not speak to him, he threw it to the ground in disgust. The friar turned and shouted to the hidden Spaniards, come out, Christians! Fall upon these dog-like infidels!" This was the signal. A single cannon shot roared from the roof of a nearby building. The sound echoed like a thunderbolt through the enclosed square. Suddenly, the quiet valley was filled with the terrifying scream of trumpets and the roar of battle cries. From the dark halls, the Spanish cavalry erupted into the sunlight. Their armor flashed, and bells were tied to their horses' legs to increase the psychological noise. The effect was immediate and devastating. To the Inca, this was not a battle. It was a supernatural collapse of reality. The horses charged directly into the dense crowd of unarmed attendants. The Spanish steel swords began a rhythmic, bloody harvest. One witness recorded that the Spaniards were cutting off hands, arms, and heads with a single blow. The Inca soldiers, paralyzed by the sound of the gunpowder and the sight of the horses, did not fight back. They tried to flee, but the square had only a few narrow exits. In their panic, the Inca crushed each other to death. A wall of the square actually collapsed under the pressure of the stampede. The center of the massacre was the emperor's litter. Pizarro knew that everything depended on this moment. He drove his horse toward Atahualpa, shouting, "Do not let the Inca be killed, let no one wound him." The Inca nobles showed incredible bravery. As the Spaniards cut off the hands of the men carrying the litter, others would take their place, holding the gold poles with their bloody stumps until they too were cut down. They refused to let their god fall to the ground. Finally, Pizarro himself reached the litter. He grabbed Atahualpa by the arm and pulled him from his throne. In the chaos, Pizarro was actually wounded in the hand by one of his own men, the only Spanish casualty of the entire day. As the Sunday King hit the dirt, the heart of the empire stopped beating. The 80,000 warriors waiting in the hills above watched in horror as their god was led away in chains. They did not attack. Without orders from the divine center, the decimal system of the Inca army froze. The most powerful force in South America became a leaderless mass of terrified men. The massacre at Cajamarca lasted less than 2 hours. In that time, 7,000 Inca people were killed. Not a single Spaniard died in combat. It was not a battle. It was an execution of a political system. The strategic implications rippled across the world almost immediately. The myth of Inca invincibility had been shattered in a single afternoon. The Spaniards had not just captured a man. They had captured a god who controlled every grain of corn and every soldier in the empire. Atahualpa, realizing that the Spaniards valued gold above all else, offered a ransom that remains the largest in history. He promised to fill a room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide with gold as high as he could reach, and twice that amount in silver. For months, the gold of an entire civilization flowed into Cajamarca. Statues, jewelry, and sacred artifacts were melted down into bars. But it was never enough. Despite the ransom being paid, the Spaniards realized that as long as Atahualpa lived, he remained a focal point for rebellion. In July 1533, they executed the emperor by strangulation. The head was gone. The body followed quickly. Cajamarca was different from any other conquest because of how purely tactical genius and psychological shock were used to bridge a gap of 1,000 to 1 in numbers. The Inca had every material advantage. They had the terrain, the numbers, the supplies, and the home field knowledge. But they were fighting a medieval war, while the Spanish were fighting a modern, total war. The Inca believed in the ritual of power. The Spanish believed in the mechanics of destruction. This victory proved that military dominance is not just about how many men you have on the field, but about how effectively you can destroy the enemy's will to fight. The capture of the Sapa Inca proved that highly centralized systems are the most vulnerable to a single surgical strike. Within a decade, the Spanish would use the Inca's own road system and bureaucracy to control the entire continent. The gold from that mountain square would flood Europe, fueling the rise of the Spanish Empire as the world's first global superpower and triggering a century of inflation that would reshape the European economy. The massacre at Cajamarca remains a haunting reminder of what happens when two civilizations meet with completely different definitions of warfare. Atahualpa thought he was inviting a few pets into his parlor. Pizarro knew he was bringing a wolf into a sheepfold. It was the day the sun set on the Andes and the dawn of a new, bloody global age. 168 men had not just won a battle. They had rewritten the history of the world through a combination of steel, horses, and a terrifying, cold-blooded tactical trick. If you want to see how this victory shaped the rise of the Spanish Empire and the ultimate fall of the Aztec kingdom, watch this next video. Subscribe for more battles where brilliant and brutal strategy changed the course of history.